Thank you, everyone who helped us be the Holy Spirit this morning. We had Catalan and Shui and Swahili and Italian and Russian and Spanish and French. It's wonderful. So today I'm going to teach you a Russian word. It's the word that's the sermon title in your bulletin, but it's in Cyrillic. And so I'll tell you how it sounds. It's ostranение. Ostranение. And it means defamiliarization, or actually estrangement, making something strange or unfamiliar.
It was such a strange word that Google said it was a misspelling. They didn't recognize it.
Right. Well, Google doesn't know everything, right?
Yeah.
Ostranение is about greeting something that you know with new eyes, taking a real beginner's mind to a complex situation, being all curiosity and openness and willingness to be surprised. Ostranение is all about promise and also about discomfort. The word comes from Russian literary theory, but for us, for me and Mitch, it's travel that is ostranение for us. Like the travel that we're going to embark on this week. We'll make announcements about the details later, but we're getting ready to be away for 3 weeks. We're going to go bicycling in Italy. We love how travel gives us an opportunity to see things through new eyes and to enter into the unfamiliar on its own terms and learn as much as we can.
So here's an example of ostranение in travel. I have a picture in my mind's eye. When I think of home, I have a picture in my mind's eye. And in my mind's eye, there's home is a cute little Cape Cod house with a tiny yard and a little garden and an oak tree. That's home. But I also love bicycling in the Yucatan, where home is this pill-shaped little structure with a thatched roof on it. Or next week, we're going to be in a place where home is this round masonry structure with an ice cream cone stuck on top.
Upside down.
Upside down. Otherwise, it would catch a lot of rain. That's the travel version of ostranение, seeing a familiar concept, but interpreted through radically different eyes, history, reality.
Ostranение makes me think of Bishop William Boyd Grove, who was the bishop of Troy Conference many years ago. And he was giving a sermon, and he was marveling that when he was traveling in Moscow a few years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he went to a McDonald's there, and the Big Mac tasted exactly like it did in the States. And
this is the opposite of ostranение.
I'm sure his point was something about the gospel, being relevant in all cultures, right? But I don't really remember his point, because what I mostly remember is thinking, you went all the way to Moscow and you went to McDonald's. Yeah. To me, the whole point of going to a new place is to taste their food, right? To get some of their language, to be able to talk to regular folk as much as possible about their lives. It's getting to know the place on their terms and not just through my American lens.
Sometimes we view the Pentecost story the way the disciples all speak in different languages as meaning that the way we understand Jesus is the correct one. And it just needs to be translated into other languages to get passed on to others as we understand it. I would say the meaning of Pentecost is precisely the opposite of that. That the many languages of that first Pentecost are an invitation to be defamiliarized so that we hear the good news of Jesus in ways that we don't immediately understand. To realize the radicality of the gospel and not all the ways we've tamed it. Instead of telling people what the good news is, we invite people to ask, what would good news mean for you? We are invited to ask people, not tell people. That can be disorienting because other people see the world differently than I do. I'm still trying to deal with that. It's really difficult.
Even your wife.
Even my wife. Experiencing the good news through somebody else's eyes and ears and heart can feel kind of like traveling to another country. As the poet David Wagner writes, wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Must ask permission to know it and be known.
Certainly, that first Pentecost was powerfully strange. All wind and fire and languages. And I don't know about you, but whenever I've been part of a whole bunch of people doing part of the Pentecost reading in other languages all at the same time, I have two thoughts, one of which is, this is so cool, and the other one is, this is so creepy. And it's about both of those things at the same time. We're called to be open to all of it. And it takes discipline and practice and faith to be greeted by something strange and not immediately push it away, but instead to respond with some humility and to ask permission to get to know it, to open ourselves to new possibilities. And the white European ancestry Christians were not always great with humility, and definitely not with asking permission. We're not great with uncertainty or the unfamiliar. It scares us. And tribute to that being afraid is the many places in our country right now where books that challenge what's been thought for a long time about race, about gender, about the climate, those books are being taken off of library shelves. In some states, the history of slavery is not allowed to be taught because it might make white students uncomfortable. It's seen as too threatening to allow those students to learn and grapple with history and figure out what their responses should be. That's that tendency to push away the unfamiliar, and if we just don't think about it, it's just not there. Unchecked, it hardens into sectarianism. And as authors Cecilia Clegg and Joe Leichty say, sectarian is belonging gone bad.
I chose the slightly unnerving painting on your cover by Carol Ost, quite purposely, rather than one of the lovely medieval paintings with the polite little flames above the disciples' heads. That painting reminds me of the tall grass prairie burning season in the Flint Hills, which just ended a couple weeks ago. In the Flint Hills of northeast Kansas, where my parents live, every spring they do a controlled burning of the rolling fields of the Flint Hills. Every spring they do this burning to replicate the ancient cycle of natural burns that used to happen when the spring storms came and the lightning would set the dry fields on fire. And it would kill off all the woody invasive plants like sumac and dogwood and cedar so that the native tall grass could grow and thrive and be food for the critters that lived there. Slowly, with these controlled burns, they're bringing the tall grass prairie back to be more like what it was 300 years ago, before white Europeans were there, when buffalo roamed and the Pawnee and the Osage and the Wichita nations hunted there. I've been able to see these burns a couple of times over the last decades, and at night, it is magically beautiful. You look at the distant hills with gold strands of flame crisscrossing the horizon like a necklace made of fire. And it's cleaning out the detritus to make fresh green growth for the new season. But as essential as it is, as beautiful as it is, that normally controlled burning does occasionally get out of control. Blown by the prairie winds in unexpected and unintended ways, instead of bringing new life, that fire can bring death and destruction. Prairie fire gone bad is a pretty good metaphor for belonging gone bad.
Because fire can be good, right? And because belonging is essential for us. That's what we are made for, is to belong to each other and to belong to the world. It helps us know who we are and who we're not. It helps us make sense of our lives. But when our belonging gets fixated on the familiar and on being comfortable above all else, when our belonging gets blown by the spirits of nationalism and racism and fear, then it is like a destructive wildfire. It's like the wildfires raging in Canada even as I speak. It's like the windstorm that blew through Houston this week with equally destructive effects. When our belonging goes bad, it ravages our humility and our humanity. We lose our capacity for empathy. We lose our ability to understand that other people are like ourselves, and anyone on the other side of any kind of divide is seen as not who we are. We stop being able to learn from the unfamiliar. I think that's exactly the opposite of what God's flames of the Spirit had in mind, that first Pentecost.
So we're heading out on vacation for 3 weeks, and we'll be traveling by bike.
Except where it's really hilly.
So when the mountains are, we might, if we're feeling weenie, we'll take a train. But we travel by bike on our vacations for a few reasons. The first is we love biking. A day on a bike is a good day, even with flat tires and rain and stuff. It's a good day.
We also love to stay in little places, in small towns and little inns, in people's farmhouses, rather than in the big resorts, though we're not above slipping into a pool at a Marriott if it's really hot, I'm just saying.
Speaking of white privilege, we can just walk into a Marriott
True.
And nobody questions it.
We like to get to know people when we travel.
Best of all, though, is the pace of bike touring. We enter a town at 12 or 13 miles an hour rather than 60.
Or in Italy, 15 kilometers an hour rather than 100, right?
And because of that, we experience it differently, more slowly, more fully.
And we're received differently when we show up on bikes. For one thing, we're eye to eye with the local folk, and it's easy to stop for a minute to ask for directions or compliment someone on how beautiful their garden is or find out where the best place is to go for dinner. Biking helps us enter into those spaces with a certain curiosity and humility that it's not impossible, but it's harder when you're behind the tinted windows of a tourist bus.
All of that is a sense of ostranение. But the most powerful sense of ostranение, that defamiliarization, is when we come home from someplace wildly different and see how alien our living, our place, our stuff is. And now we see our own familiar with defamiliared eyes. And one writer said, I no longer recognize familiar things. I finally see them.
So it's Pentecost. And sometimes the story of that first Pentecost is told as a powerful tale of supernatural glory, which it was. And there's a message of go, present the good news to the whole world in every language. And that's part of the story. Go and tell everyone the life-changing truth that you have met in Jesus. Bring your interpretation of that good news to all the people that you know. Sometimes we mainline Christians have a different problem, which is that we don't always know what we want to tell people about Jesus, but that's a whole nother sermon.
Or even if we should tell someone. Yeah.
That's another story.
But in there is that assumption that we're going to tell our reality, our interpretation, as the universal reality. And today we want you to consider the opposite side of Pentecost. That before we go barreling out to proclaim our interpretation, we first engage this strange story with the certain humility that comes from ostranение, seeing the familiar with fresh eyes. Before we're all over someone else with the good news, the way we see it, we're suggesting that we take time to get to know that person's reality, their language, their worldview. We're suggesting that we ask permission to share our life-changing truth and recognize that it's ours. And only do that once we've come to know them well enough to be able to hear and value and celebrate other people's life experiences.
So this humility does not forget the power of the wind and the flame of the Holy Spirit. In fact, I feel like this humility relies on the Spirit's wind and flame because we're going to need all the courage and perseverance we can get to really hear another's story, to really allow it to enter into us. It's not easy for me to set aside my preconceived ideas of what I believe is right or what works for me. We're going to need all of the help, all the spirit, all the breath and fire we can get so that we can sum up enough creativity and resilience and grace to share God's love, especially in a world that doesn't give a lot of shrift to God's love.
We want to share with you a poem by gay Irish poet named Patrick O'Tuma. It's addressing God with some questions. And I said to him, "Are there answers to all of this?"
And he said, "The answer is in a story, and the story is being told."
And I said, "But there is so much pain."
And she answered plainly, "Pain will happen."
Then I said, "Will I ever find meaning?"
And they said, "You will find meaning where you give meaning. The answer is in a story, and the story isn't finished."
So, welcome, friends, to Pentecost, the never-ending story.